I think I could use one of those shock vests for when I see people not return their cart at the grocery store. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2021 action comedy Jolt, which will be released on Prime Video on July 23rd. A big thank you to Amazon for providing me with an early screener of this movie to review. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Jolt stars Kate Beckinsale, Stanley Tucci, and Bobby Cannavale, and was directed by Tanya Wexler. It tells the story of Lindy, played by Kate Beckinsale, who's a woman with severe intermittent explosive disorder. In order to control her violent outbursts, she uses an experimental treatment, but things get complicated when an attack leaves her seeking revenge. I always love a good female-led action movie. I like most action movies, but there's always something extra compelling to me about an action movie with a woman in the lead role. We've had a bit of a surge in recent years. Everything from Wonder Woman to Atomic Blonde to Gunpowder Milkshake just last week, but comparatively, they're still more rare than male-led action movies. So, anytime I see a new female-led action movie's coming out, I jump at the chance to watch it. And when that movie's also directed by a woman, as is the case here, it's even more exciting, because there's a different perspective behind the camera and potential for a more authentic character presentation, because the director can relate and connect on a different level. Unfortunately, that can be hindered by a script written by somebody who isn't on that same wavelength. And it's abundantly clear that that was the case with Jolt. I gotta say, I really like the premise for Jolt. It's not anything overly creative, but there's something admirable about its straightforward nature, because you don't necessarily want something overly intricate for an action movie like this. A simple premise that sets up for and explains the chaos and action to come is more than enough. On paper, the premise here initially seems very reminiscent of a certain other electricity-driven action movie, but I will say that it's fairly different. Rather than using electrical shocks and other stimulation to stay alive, our main character here uses electricity to keep others alive, because it's the only thing she can do to repress her own violent impulses. This impulse control and repression side of the story is done really well during the first act of the movie. I think the editing in particular during these outburst scenes is really effective. It does a good job of putting you in the mindset of Lindy. You really see and feel the scene play out as she does. Once something triggers one of her outbursts, all of a sudden the editing shifts. The camera focuses in on little details, somebody's mouth as they talk, or somebody repeatedly tapping a pencil. We see Lindy's attempts at keeping calm, and her quickly starting to lose that battle. The sound changes as she becomes overwhelmed with rage. Things get muffled, and we hear ear ringing and the sound of Lindy's heartbeat and breathing. All of these things leading up to either her snapping or her shocking herself. And the movie plays around with that a bit to kind of keep you on your toes. And so this movie's got a fun and fairly unique premise with a lot of potential, and it really works for the first act. Once the main plot of the story is instigated, this movie quickly starts to fall apart. The script is a bit of a mess, and does very little with the interesting premise it has to work with. It all plays out very bizarrely. There's a clear goal set forth at the end of the first act, but the story manages to feel almost aimless after that point. I mean, we know what Lindy wants to accomplish, but it feels so haphazard. Maybe they were trying to go for the whole she's chaotic and unpredictable thing, but it felt like there wasn't really much of a story path. Things sort of just happen, often in ways that don't feel remotely realistic. Now, obviously, this movie's not based on a true story, so a little bit of heightened reality is to be expected, but the way the story beats string together and the way people interact with Lindy just doesn't make much sense even within this fictional world. And this script has got some awful, kind of cringy dialogue at points that really no actor could save, so some of the performances come off not so great as a result. Likely due to the script, the tone of this film is also incredibly bizarre. As with the other components of this movie, the tonal balance was decent during the first act. The character of Lindy's set up as maybe a little too cool, being overly sardonic and badass, but she's not awful, and there's this good blend of action and sarcastic humor, especially with some of the back and forth between her and her doctor. But once we move out of that first act, things get super messy with the tone. Some movies succeed at blending humor and action and cool characters, but the tones just clash here and never feel like they belong together. The humor is especially out of place here, which seems weird because this is the type of ridiculous action story that's ripe for comedy. It's just the wrong type of comedy. Like I mentioned before, the dialogue's pretty bad, so we have these overly fake, quippy moments or some really cringy, unfunny jokes. And there's one moment in particular in a hospital where the humor just suddenly goes off the rails in the most bizarre kind of way that's hard to even articulate in a review. Jolt is a film that had a spark of an idea, a premise with the potential to deliver an extremely entertaining story and also possibly explore a character that we've never quite seen before. Instead, it's a bizarre, underwhelming film that feels like a modified and recycled script from the mid-2000s. It's not a total power failure, but the components that do work aren't enough to produce the voltage necessary for keeping this movie playing on many screens. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro here is definitely the premise. Although it has some similarities to other films, the way this concept is constructed is pretty original. We get a character who, due to a biological disorder, is extremely volatile and can violently snap at any minute on anybody if it weren't for her experimental shock vest. But one of the most interesting aspects of that is that she, the person with the impulse control issues, is the one in control of activating her own repression treatment. She doesn't have a handler or anything, so that introduces this extra layer to the story once the revenge plot kicks in. The first act does a great job with introducing and setting up this premise. It's just a shame that the rest of the film can't really deliver on its potential. On the con side, the biggest issue has gotta be the tone. It tries to mix action, dark humor, and snappy comedy, but it just doesn't work here at all. There are plenty of films that have nailed that tonal blend, so it can be done. It just wasn't here. The humor especially feels extremely out of place. Rather than working with the inherent silliness of the premise, it comes across feeling really forced, and like it's trying too hard to be funny and cool and witty. And so it ends up being none of those things. In addition to its cringy, unfunny moments, the film also has these incredibly random moments of absurdity. There's only a couple of them, but they come completely out of nowhere and feel like they're from an entirely different movie. Con number 2 certainly contributed to the first con a bit, and that's the script. It's so strange, because like I said, this movie has a good premise, and the first act is pretty decent, but then it's like somebody else wrote the rest of the movie. At least in the credits, only one person's listed as the writer here, so I don't have any logical explanation as to why the film is the way it is. There's some truly awful dialogue, and after the catalyzing event at the end of the first act, this movie suddenly becomes very disparate things without any cohesive guiding direction. It's an action movie that slides from decent to really trite, then back again. It's a revenge story, but it's a bizarre comedy. It has an investigation, but it's got a weird take on the buddy cop dynamic. And then oftentimes, it feels like an unintentional parody of itself. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Jolt 2.5 out of 5 paws, but it's a very low 2.5, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if it drops down for me on rewatch once the novelty of the premise wears off. It's a baffling movie that doesn't have any clear sense of identity and is gonna leave you not knowing what to make of it, at best. I would recommend Jolt mostly to people who are really big fans of the actors involved. The script does not give them much to work with, and while they may have had some fun making the movie, I think only Stanley Tucci could be considered good here. If you like big, silly revenge action movies from the 2000s and thought the premise sounded interesting, it's probably worth giving this one a shot. Just be aware that it doesn't use its premise to its full potential. If you liked Jolt, I've obviously got to recommend Crank. These are going to be two films that get compared a lot just because of the electrical element, but they are fairly different from one another story-wise. Crank has a very weird tonal blend too, and it's just a wild film. So if you want some crazy Jason Statham action from the mid-2000s, you might like it. If you want another action movie from that era with a violence repression component, you should check out Unleashed. It's a more dramatic action movie that focuses on a man who's been trained since childhood to violently attack anybody when his metal collar is removed. And if you're interested in another recent and much better film by the same director as Jolt, you might want to watch Buffaloed. This was Tanya Wexler's last film and blends its humor quite a bit better, delivering an entertaining and very original story. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Jolt? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that features an experimental medical treatment? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you get some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.